I'd say to kick off, we're obviously spending the whole day talking about evaluation. I know it's a significant investment that we make on the part of the Department of Homeland Security. I know that it is a priority to do good evaluation of these types of programs and understand what's effective and make sure we do no harm among my partners across the U.S. government and internationally. And I'm very happy to be able to talk about this particular topic today and to introduce the topic. You know, there are a lot of different types of prevention. Some of those prevention activities are pretty far away from an actual violent event. So today we have this distinguished panel to talk about how we can think about and what we can learn and what we might know about how to evaluate those types of early intervention programs that are sort of distal to an actual violent event. So Wendy, with your extensive background in criminal justice evaluation, working with courts, working with diversion programs for adults, for youth, et cetera, for different topics, what are the types of methods and what experiences do you think might be most helpful when we're talking about these very rare and unique violence prevention programs in order to evaluate them?
Now? Okay. I think that, can I answer another question first? So why Rick likes me. I wanted to just take a second to talk about a program evaluator as a person, because there is often a perception, and sometimes justified, that the program evaluator is there to judge your program, that they are there to give a thumbs up or a thumbs down, and therefore program evaluation is very risky. That's a very rational thought to have, but ways to mitigate that, I would suggest, include engaging with your evaluator early. Help them get to know your program, not just a spreadsheet that is going to come out of the data collection that we were just talking about. Get them to know your team and the objectives that your team has. That's really going to help them be informed as they look at the data, right? It's all data, while quote unquote objective, still needs to be interpreted. So I would start there with your evaluation partner. And regarding the data, I think, well, one more thing about evaluation. The other reason, aside, you care and you want to show change, but we can harm people, and Rick just alluded to this. So it's our responsibility, it's service providers' responsibility to make sure that you're operating a program that is following best practices or evidence-informed practices, and checking yourselves. It's not just an evaluator's job, because literally we can harm people. And so that is a huge responsibility that you have. And then on the data collection side, just as you wouldn't think about doing a program without the clients, in my opinion, I don't think you should think about doing your program without collecting data. It's to your best interest to demonstrate what you're doing and then have your team evaluate. It's not, you can do internal evaluations. Third party is always stronger, or usually stronger, but we need to think about data collection as integral to your program as the clients. That's how important it is. So to now answer your question, the similarities in populations across any number of areas, whether it's a public health intervention, a CVE intervention, or criminal justice intervention, there's some key things that are applicable across those areas, right? So things like the leadership team and stakeholders, which has been discussed here, implementation strategies, which we also touched on a little bit. Are your staff qualified, trained, credentialed where necessary? Do they have the clinical supervision that they need? Your assessment process, please have one, right? And I know we're going to talk about specific tools later, but standardized assessment tools that are appropriate for your population is key. And because we know research has shown, this has been studied for many years, that clinical impressions as a guide to who you're going to take into your program or what services they're going to get is nowhere near as effective as clinical judgment along with objective standardized measures. So that would be my answer to the question of like some of the similarities across all of these groups. And certainly those are things criminal justice programs rely on.
Excellent, Wendy. Thank you very much. Any follow-on thoughts or reactions from the remainder of the panel? No. Yes? I see a button.
I think I would just add, like staying flexible and being like having flexible management in terms of like sometimes we might face situations like the COVID situation that we had. So your intervention could be face-to-face and suddenly turn online, and you planned and developed and created all these kind of data that would be collected using face-to-face methods or like or facilitated by that, and suddenly you need to change that. So in that sense, staying flexible, staying kind of aware of what's happening globally, regionally, threat assessments, I think that's the only thing that I would add to your perfect answer. Thank you.
Fantastic. Todd, maybe this would be a good time to talk about, once we're focusing on these particular subsets of interventions, what are some of the challenges and potential solutions in thinking about designing an evaluation program for them?
Okay. All right, this seems to be working. A couple observations. Some of this derived from not only doing the CVE toolkit that we did, which is available. So if any of you are interested in that, that's online at RAND for evaluations, but also doing evaluations that we did in Africa, in Indonesia, and the Philippines, evaluating CVE programs there. So one observation, unique thing that struck me about that effort was the need for programs to have narrow, the value of narrow program goals. And narrow program goals facilitate both measurement, because it's easier to measure. And I love the comment earlier about it's easier to measure changes in depression rather than changes in mental health. One is vague, one is specific. And the latter, of course, has very specific measurements attached to it. But also it facilitates outcomes. And I'll give you an example. So we evaluated a radio program in northern Nigeria. It was 12-episode installment program. And when we started working with the implementer to do the evaluation, they had multiple goals they wanted to achieve out of this radio program. They wanted to change perceptions about role models, change perceptions about kidnap victims in northern Nigeria, which is a problem. They wanted to change views about rehabilitation. They wanted to change views about extremism. They probably had a list of about 3 or 4 other things out of basically a 12-episode program. So not only were the goals too obscure and vague, like role models, how do you measure that? But there are also so many goals that they really limited their ability, because you have to think about effect sizes on your treatments. Do you have a sufficient effect size on your treatment to change the outcomes you want to change? Because you want to give yourself the best chance at producing a positive effect. And in that case, a 12-episode program to achieve 8 specific outcomes, there just was not the effect size. You couldn't produce enough content to change all those outcomes. So I'm a big advocate of logic models, as much as I hate to do them myself, because it helps programs think more clearly about what it is they're trying to do, and then connect that to the outcomes. But yeah, it'd be my initial observation.
Follow on? Any thoughts?
I mean, the only thing that comes to mind is what helps me personally deal with that is like using Bronfenbrenner's ecological system theory in addition to the logic model. because I think that gives us a better view of like in the situation that we're dealing with, there are various levels of influence on individuals and communities, and we need to keep this holistic vision in mind in order to identify gaps and like actually target these needs.
To follow on, I would say it's very important to manage expectations, which is what you were alluding to with the 12 sessions and having these incredible multiple outcomes. You know that it's funny in criminal justice in a very sad way that we put people in jail for a year with little to no programming, and then the sheriff checks recidivism. Why are you expecting a change in behavior? That is not logical. And so, but also managing the expectations of your funder. So that is to be in communication with them and be clear with them about what is happening, because you do need to be flexible, absolutely, have adaptations in mind if things aren't going well. Manage the expectations of your team, but just think about what could actually be accomplished, right? If you have a 90-day program, looking at outcomes 3 years later, it's got to be a really, really, really awesome 90-day program to have 3-year outcomes. So managing expectations is an important component of programming, but also program evaluation.
I know it was only 12 episodes, but Star Wars was only 9, and I saw like 3 cars with personalized license plates referencing Star Wars on my way here today. So, clear communication, realistic expectations, writing down what those expectations are ahead of time. These things all sound universal to any evaluation or any kind of program where you're trying to implement change. I think one of the challenges that we face as a community in trying to do and think about prevention is when it's not so obvious that you're intervening with a specific individual who you are concerned about, and rather you're trying to influence more broadly to, say, reduce vulnerability or something like that, that it might be a little bit harder to tie those outcomes to things that funders might care about or be able to articulate clearly. Do you have any advice for how to help get past that argument of how many attacks did you stop today?
Yeah, well, first, funders should not make the expectation on any specific program that it's going to reduce violence. It's too small. There are too few attacks in the United States, for example, to be able to measure a reduction, much less connect it to a specific program. It just can't be done. I think what programs need to be held responsible for is whether or not they're achieving the intermediate effects they're trying to achieve. So, for example, a program that tries to improve at-risk youth socialization. Are they able to build a support network for youth to give them people to rely on and connections and things like that? And their theory is, of course, I imagine that if they can do that, then at-risk youth might be less likely to find their social needs within extremist organizations. Well, you're not going to be able to measure whether or not your group of 20 youth are not going into extremist organizations. But you can probably measure whether or not you're changing the socialization outcomes that you're trying to achieve. I think it's a two-part issue. One, programs want to be able to show those big effects. And number two, funders, of course, like those big effects on violence. But I think the expectations for both need to be adjusted.
One thing that comes to mind is I think we can I'm going to piggyback on what you said and continue with the medium term. It's maybe I feel like the gain or the capacity building component would be important to ensure that the stakeholders are supported with evidence-based resources and guidance from the earliest possible. So this is kind of one thing that we can actually benefit from, and a fit for use approach like to that. Does these programs help these priority populations or not?
I guess I could add that this whole area, again, has been touched upon throughout the morning, that this is about a culture change. And so criminal justice dealt with that. For example, one of the primary areas I study is drug courts. We had some judges who were champions, to be sure, right out of the gate, but there are a lot of judges and prosecutors and police officers and sheriffs who are like, I don't hug thugs, and what are you guys doing? And this is not going to help them, and et cetera. So to the extent that you're delving into an area that is in the midst of a culture change, I would document those things. How are you pulling people together? Have you developed a pathway for client referrals, for example? And that is coming from, who's the source of that? And especially if it's someone we don't expect, like law enforcement is helping to get someone into therapy. It's not that they're opposed to it. It's just not usually, you can't assume law enforcement will participate. Let's say it that way. I would document those things because that is important. That is a contribution from I would think, from a funder's perspective, though he's the funder. So I'll see what he says.
Research, only the research. So
Point.
yeah, please.
I mean, I think it's important to talk how sessions like this one is really useful in our field, and like is actually the key for continuous improvement and refinement, because it's based on like sharing experiences and like having collaborative evaluation that would kind of let us share what we're facing and how we can find solutions to the problems that we're facing as a group, and using collective intelligence also to do that.
So in exactly that vein, the next question, I think that we potentially could go down the line, and we've already heard one or two. I'd like to think about some of the key points that we've been discussing about helping to set expectations, manage relationships between a number of different people. Like we've heard about today, we have funders, we have clients, we have external stakeholders, we have people trying to run the program, and how we need to be thinking about all of those things as we enter into like a partnership for evaluation. And I was wondering if we could get maybe one example from your experience that illustrates how these work or don't work if you get them wrong, that we could talk about.
Picking my example, because there's a lot of them. One that is ongoing and that we're actually still grappling with in a funded project that I have that involves family treatment courts or family drug courts. The treatment courts are reliant upon the child welfare system to refer clients to them. However, the child welfare agency has issued a policy that the only way they'll refer people to the family treatment court is if there's a dependency petition filed. Not to go into all the mishigas about that, but it's a very serious point in time if you're filing a dependency petition against a parent. The whole idea of treatment courts is in part to not get to that very serious point in time. And so there are serious philosophical differences. In addition, the client for the child welfare system is the child. The client in the FTC is the parent. So that in and of itself poses some tensions or different goals that need to be sorted out. And when you have an agency that is just kind of, this is our policy and this is what we do, I would love to have some suggestions on how to work with that, because we haven't cracked it yet. I mean, we're trying. We've developed a form that got put into their database so that, early identification of clients that would flag cases and so forth. But we're still at this point of the dependency petition. So sometimes it might not work, but you got to try.
So being aware of interrelated policies that might pose barriers when you're trying to lower barriers to entry for a program, being aware as early as possible of the types of legal policy or bureaucratic barriers that may prevent somebody or deter somebody from participating. Great.
The question's about relationships, right? And let me ask, I'll try to answer this just from perspective of the researcher and implementer relationship. And I don't think implementers always need researchers. I think even basic pre-post testing done on a program can help identify issues in implementation, issues in adoption of the program, or of course in outcomes. But if there is a researcher involved, I think getting the researcher involved early is key. In our case, in the Nigeria piece, we came in late. I mean, we actually were there at the beginning, but they didn't reach out to us until they knew what they wanted to do. And at that point, they were set in their ways. And it was really hard to convince them to scale back their treatment goals, to change their treatment goals, or to change their intervention in ways that we thought would best allow them to reach their treatment goals. So those relationships earlier in the process, I think, are really helpful. I think sometimes, especially if you're going to be like formally evaluated and you want to put your best foot forward, then you want to make sure that your intervention can show as strong of an effect as you can possibly give it. And so getting the researcher in early will help them, for example, adopt the measurements to the research questions, which then, you know, a more effective measurement has more reliability, more validity, more able to show an effect. So those types of all things, I think, are helpful, and getting at the ground level, I think, is helpful.
I mean, I would add to that, like having like a multi-sectoral approach, or keeping that always in mind. A collaboration and data sharing is super important. Creating these communities of practice in your project or in your program is important. Yeah, that's it.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. I would like to open up and see if we have any questions here. Everybody had an opportunity to see the topics ahead of time. We have the time of these folks here, and so if there are any questions whatsoever that we can try to answer as a group, we'd be more than happy to try to answer them, knowing that we're standing between everyone and lunch.
Here we go, Jamie.
Thanks, Neil. So my question has to do maybe not with the actually evaluation, but the politicized nature of this work, and like how to tell stories out about it in a positive way that doesn't create too much visibility. Where my project's housed at a university, and we've gotten a lot of pushback from university leadership because of negative visibility. So how to tell the story of what we're doing in pursuit of democracy, security, peace, in a time when that's not always seen as a good thing. So how to do this work in the politicized context that we're in.
I'll try to answer that, not just from an evaluation perspective, but I'll give you my own experience. We recently did a survey of veterans' attitudes toward various extremist topics, extremist groups, as well as ideologies. And I think it would have been really easy for us to be very narrow-minded in our approach to that, because I think a lot of us are thinking, well, right-wing extremism, where that seems to be where a lot of the attacks are coming from, or plots are coming from. So let's just focus it uniformly on that. But I think that would have been inappropriate on a number of different levels, because that's not the only, right-wing is not the only form of extremism that's out there. I think so ignoring left-wing varieties would be a mistake. Just as just at face value, but then also politically, recognizing the environment we're in and recognizing that we want our results to get accepted and adopted by a wide variety of constituents, then again, it wouldn't be helpful to just focus on right-wing extremism. So we made sure to try and even our questions out to address various different types, because not only it was the right thing to do, to ask about questions like Antifa, but also we knew that it would make the results, I think, more palatable across a wider spectrum. So to the extent that programs can do those types of things, and I know programs are sort of set in their ways sometimes because they have specific target audiences they're reaching, and sometimes diversity can help that or not help that. But I think the more programs are able to be diverse and address different forms, it sort of undercuts a lot of the criticisms that are out there about political overreach or targeting conservatives, which are legitimate concerns. So that's my observation.
To be very careful. So none of us here are in the business of trying to tell people what to think or feel or believe, right? We do want to, I think that some recent research is starting to bear out that a lot of the risk factors that we tend to be concerned about maybe are less predictive than the amount of vulnerability that exists with somebody who's bought into or has some specific grievance that they're channeling into something. And so focusing more on making people less vulnerable and more stable in their lives rather than focusing on trying to change something that we might interpret as risky, which is never, no individual risk factor is predictive, and none of it, in any combination gives you a really good idea of what outcomes are. Not focusing on ideology, and focusing on the positive is, I think, at least one way to help reduce the likelihood of some of those criticisms, and then being very self-critical of what we're putting out. And this kind of goes back to that first do no harm, and trying to make sure that we're not putting out information from our personal or community or assumed perspectives that might not be counter to the belief systems of other people, because I think we're all aware that when you communicate in those ways and do those things, not only are they easily misinterpreted, but presenting people who might have an entrenched belief system with a counterfactual tends to just push them further into that belief system. And so it's counterproductive. So, those are, I think about this a lot more than I want to. And so those are some of the things that I think might be important to take into consideration when you're thinking about what the real end goal of these programs are or should be.
So we talked in the last panel about being judicious in the data you're collecting, recognizing some of the concerns, valid concerns from communities about participating in these programs and not wanting their data shared for purposes that aren't connected to the programs themselves. At the same time, when you make decisions of we're not going to collect any personally identifiable data for people participating in this program, it impacts the ways in which you measure outcomes and impact. And Todd, I specifically wanted to ask you, but Wendy, I think you may have thoughts as well. I previewed our Screen Hate campaign earlier. We don't track where people go after seeing our campaign because we wanted to protect their privacy. At the same time, it makes it very difficult for us to know, are they in fact downloading the app? And are they in fact getting to practitioners through our directory? So how do you strike that balance between protecting privacy and ensuring credibility of your programs, that they're not being used for purposes outside of the purpose of these programs, while also being able to measure impact?
Hi, Brett. It's a really interesting question. I missed the showing of that video, but I this morning because I guess I was late. But I will say that I think there's no like single solution to measurement and evaluation. There's no single approach. There's various different ways to approach evaluation. I think for, online material, there's a lot of outcomes that you can look at online to see whether or not a program is being effective. In that case, you could certainly count the number of downloads. And maybe there's technical data that can support information about how often the program's being accessed and being used. And I would imagine that would provide a lot of data about its utility and use. Now, but of course, to evaluate things like how they're impacting ultimate end users, do they like it? Do they not like it? Is it good or bad? Is it helpful? Is it achieving the outcomes you're trying to achieve? Then you would have to talk to them in one way or another. And I don't think you ever have to collect personally identifiable data. Maybe not ever, but I mean, personally, that's like very specific data. I mean, you can do surveys without collecting names of respondents, for example. So it's really easy to collect I think most evaluations data could be collected anonymously, or at least separated from their name and identities. And, and of course, I think you just have to have consent forms and be upfront with folks, right? I mean, like, we want you to participate in this study. You don't have to participate in this study, but if you did, it would really help us achieve these types of results. And I think in that case, a lot of people are willing to do these to participate in these evaluations. And especially if you can provide some assurances that their data will be protected. And in all my years doing research at RAND, I've not worked at RAND as long as Brian Jackson, but I've been there not close to that 23 years, maybe less than 20 years. But I've never experienced a problem with audiences being willing to participate in studies. Either in various different forms. We've always been able to collect the data that we need to collect.
I certainly agree with the point of count everything you can. So if you ask organizations to share or put, a link to this on their page, count everything that you can. But I also think if you had a chance for a pop-up survey, keep it way short, like 3 questions. It's going to take 6 seconds. That's the kind of thing that I think would be helpful to you.
Hi, thank you. Generally, for the whole panel, what do you see as the role of artificial intelligence to aid measurement and evaluation efforts?
So, well, that's a great question. I think it depends on what the program is and what you're trying to evaluate. I think artificial intelligence like ChatGPT, I think RAND is starting to explore this. We collect a lot of studies that collect qualitative data with interviews, and going through that and analyzing that qualitative data is a pain. And it takes time. Requires some systematic methods. But I think we're exploring, can you just dump that into ChatGPT and say, give me the top 5 themes with numbers of subjects for each one, right? So as long as when you get better at doing the search requests, you can start doing some more complicated things. I think we've already started doing work using social media, analyzing social media data with ChatGPT. So we can add in upwards of thousands and thousands of tweets if you get sort of the subscription model of OpenAI's platform, and then ask it to identify the top themes in that data. And that was very useful. So if you're interested in how online attitudes are changing, for example, and if you're able to actually collect social media data, which is getting harder now with Twitter, increasing costs to access their platform. But you know, you don't need to be a huge expert. You just need to be pretty smart about the ways you do the search questions. But ChatGPT is not going to collect your data. So that's on you. And of course, ChatGPT is probably only useful for certain types of data and probably less useful for others. But I think researchers are just starting to figure that out now.
In the distant future, I think, you know, should generative AI live up to what people assume it will be, and even half of those promises, I predict that it will change potentially not only evaluation, but the ways in which we might predict outcomes in general. Because, you know, one of the reasons that I had to sit through so many semesters of statistics classes in graduate school was because we can't do experiments. But in the future, generative AI could change the way social scientists work, because we could create agents with generative AI that then we can impose experiments on, and they're not real people. And it may approximate, we may learn that it approximates different types of group or individual human behavior. And we may be able to do all kinds of experiments that would be completely unethical in regards to doing the same thing with real humans. So in the big picture, I think it could literally change everything, and supplement the empirical knowledge that we've already developed about these things. And that will be interesting.
I just wanted to add a note about the prediction part, and because this came up a little earlier too, just to follow on to say, when we use those assessment tools, the standardized tools, yes, they spit out a percent chance of recidivism or whatever that is. It's important to remember that that's without intervention. Y'all are providing an intervention. So it's back to my jail example, right? So we use the level of service inventory, LSI, and its iterations. And yeah, someone's at high risk for recidivism. They have a substance use problem. They've been arrested 18 times. They've been doing this for 20 years. They're actually pretty expert at it. If we don't do anything with them, they're going to offend again. They're going to, continue to engage in that kind of behavior, criminal behavior, harm themselves, and so forth. So I would just have everyone take a breath about the predictive part, because it's without anything. If we don't do anything, this is the likelihood. And that's where you guys step right in and change the trajectory.
And I shouldn't have used that word. I get in all kinds of discussions about the word predict all the time with people inside the government, because when I say predict, I'm talking about all these very academic hedged terms of, I predict that in an average case, this percentage of the time we would find a certain value, and that's a prediction. I'm not talking about forecasting a person's future. I'm not talking about a crystal ball.
We had a question come from online. Question for Rick and or the panel. How would you suggest programs insulate against interpreting regression to the mean? That is, when people come into a program as particularly high risk, in parentheses, at attitudinal or behavioral extremes, most often they will scale back, regardless of the intervention. How do we ensure that the reported effects are effects of the program and not something else?
That's nearly impossible to do. And because they're not an experimental case, you don't have their doppelganger who doesn't get treatment and they do get treatment, and then you can ascribe changes in the individual to the treatment they received. I do think it's important to be realistic about these things and understand that sort of following on with what Wendy just said, when people exhibit certain kinds of vulnerabilities and they lack protection from those vulnerabilities, they lack certainty of things like food and housing or healthcare or mental health care or any other types of sort of pro-social conditions that would put them at more serious, make their risk more serious, and you start to provide those things, it's unlikely that negative outcomes would be due to it, and it's equally not like it's like 100% chance they're not going to do well if you do nothing. So by providing something, we can learn over time what those interventions will mean to somebody who's in that kind of condition.
I'll just add on, I think your best protection against that is random assignment, and a pre-post evaluation, and a sufficient number of participants, so that you have a lot of power in your analysis. In other words, basically a lot of participants makes it easier to detect effects. Probably a lot of participants probably also helps limit the effective outliers on the data. So I would say those are probably the best protections.
Sometimes they're not possible, right? And if you think about it in a more tangible sort of way, we have metal detectors in all of our airports. We're probably not going to randomly assign who gets to not go through a metal detector. So, when it comes to these kinds of questions and the demands in the criminal justice community, in my criminal justice background, telling local politicians and law enforcement that certain people are not going to get an intervention that they think is going to work really well, that's very hard to sell politically. It doesn't mean that it's going to work well. It doesn't mean that it's a good idea to not do random assignment. It's just very difficult to do sometimes. And I think we need to be realistic about that.
I think you more or less addressed my question. I guess I'm wondering about, are there examples of randomized controlled trials when it comes to secondary or tertiary prevention? Are there ethical concerns? I know that that's the gold standard of evaluation. So has that ever happened? Is that happening?
The studies that we did, we used random assignment, but I don't think it was secondary and tertiary. I think it was more primary prevention. So in Nigeria, like we basically recruited folks from a panel and randomly assigned them to listen to the radio show or to not listen to the radio show. In the Philippines, we randomly assigned barangays, with local communities, to participate. So I think it gets a lot more difficult if you're talking about randomly assigning a treatment for interventions designed to pull people out of extremism. And, you're talking about a hotline where folks call into the hotline because they're planning an attack. Well, obviously that you don't randomize, probably. So, but I think it also depends on, I think to your question before, though, I think a lot of the effects that not all of the treatments I imagine that everyone's doing here are surefire winners. My guess is some will do really well and some may not do so well. So I don't think it's always like we're withholding interventions that we know to be like really impactful, and therefore it's, I think, risky to not expose people to those interventions. And this is, I think, a highly discussed issue in the epidemiology and medical fields, right? I mean, Is it fair to withhold a cancer treatment or not withhold a cancer treatment? Well, you don't know if that cancer treatment's any good unless you do the evaluation. And it may be that it's so effective that you stop the evaluation halfway and just say it's a winner and now everybody gets it. I mean, but that's a fundamental challenge, I think, with an evaluation is how do you justify withholding treatment and under what conditions? And I think you highlight a lot of the challenges in that. But I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, if we're talking from an academic being able to say, yes, we have concrete evidence that this treatment is effective, without random assignment, you can't get there. I think for 90% of what you all are doing, you don't need that level of confidence. You need to be able to show people are better after my treatment than they were before the treatment, and whatever outcomes you're measuring. And I think, so anyway.
Denise Gottfriedson did a randomized control trial of drug courts in Baltimore. So it does happen, but actually that was a very long time ago, relative to today. But I think if someone's interested in that, they need to have all the stakeholders at the table, and judges are particularly resistant to the idea that this person's in front of them and they're going to get this, but this person's going to get the whole package or something really great. So you have to do some persuasion and work on those relationships. And it definitely helps if what the control group gets is something good, not nothing, right? So if you have a base treatment program and you want to put something on top of it. So some people go to the treatment program as you have designed already. Other people get that treatment program plus this extra thing on top is a way to handle that. If they get nothing though, like treatment as usual and TAU is acronyms. Oh, she was right there. I said that first, then the acronym. Can't be nothing. People rightly, are concerned about that.
Well, I will say, I think sometimes it could be nothing, but at minimum, you need to monitor your populations. And just from a, if you wanted to evaluate a treatment for depression, you're not going to randomly assign someone to nothing and then come back 10 months later and see if they're still alive, right? You gotta have some sort of touch point on them to make sure that they're evaluating. But at the same time, you still need a strong differential between your treatment and control condition to be able to establish whether or not there's effect. And I'll also say that I think when we talk about random assignment, I think the job for random assignment is at the funder level. The funders need to determine that a treatment warrants that type of evaluation or not, because it requires a lot of money. Random evaluation is expensive. If for no other reason, then you have to follow the people that aren't attending your treatment program. And to follow the people that aren't attending your treatment program is expensive, much less the need to ensure that all your P's and Q's are squared away to be able to justify the expenses of the evaluation to ensure you have enough power to get the effects that you're looking to get. You don't want to spend a lot of money to show no effect. And at the end, you're like, well, there's no effect, but we don't really know if there's no effects. We have to do another evaluation, right? If you're going to do it right. And I think the funders have to be able to fund that type of level of evaluation sufficiently to make it worthwhile. Otherwise, pre-post evaluations that individual programs are on the hook for is probably wildly sufficient.
The other problem with doing RCTs, randomized controlled trials in this area, with a lot of sort of interventions that involve criminal justice, is oftentimes the people that are provided with those kinds of interventions at any level or allowed to participate in those interventions in diversion programs are the people that a judge or someone else arbitrarily thinks are the people who are most likely to benefit from it and succeed. And that historically makes those types of programs notoriously difficult to evaluate. And that is a reality. So we're thinking about striving for the best evidence and understanding broadly what that evidence tells us is sort of the description of primarily what I am concerned with in my career. And so there are a number of things that we are trying to do. And one of those things that I'll point out here, which would be a quick place to look to understand what the state of science is in that in that respect, is that we at the Department of Homeland Security, along with my colleagues at Public Safety Canada and a number of other governments, have funded a whole series of systematic reviews of evidence with the Campbell collaboration. Those are all published online in the Campbell Library. We're continuing to do so. We want to be open and honest about the state of evidence and the quality of evidence, and where gaps in evidence exists that the scientific community should think about pursuing. So we do care about that a lot.
That dovetails right into my question, which is for all the panelists, is there a particular recent contribution to the CVE literature that you want to share with us that you thought was particularly innovative? And secondly, what are the major gaps as you see it that research needs to address? So kind of what are some of your burning questions that are priorities for future research?
My research was very innovative. I mean, it was, but it does, but it's like in a lot of ways it doesn't apply. Like we did cool stuff. We recruited people in Northern Nigeria, randomly assigned them, and then basically rewarded people for listening to the show by asking them questions. If they got the question right via text message, then they got $1. The other folks were randomly assigned to watch sports. It's a pretty interesting model, right? But in my view, but not really applicable to, I think, 90% of the things that are done here. I think so it wouldn't be, I think, fair to say that that's something you should aspire to. And I'll just note one other thing too, going back to what I said before, that is there's pre-post evaluations, there's RCT, but there's also a lot of stuff in the middle. There's convenient samples. Maybe you can't reach everybody who wants to participate in your program. That's a wait list. Wait list makes a great evaluation comparison. So there's a lot of natural controls that are out there that can be used to not only save money, but also really expand your ability to show that your program is effective.
The only thing I would add to this is like, we shouldn't underestimate using mixed methods or qualitative data to complement whatever we have in the quantitative and what the regressions give us. Like, I think quantitative data give us a certain perspective and qualitative data maybe can explain why some of the data, there is variations in it. So that's the only thing I would add.
To follow on from that, I would answer a big concern is the small sample sizes. That if you're in the secondary, tertiary prevention space in this topic, they are small sample sizes. So you do have to use mixed methods and think about process evaluations and the change in culture that I mentioned earlier, but it's hard because the sample sizes are small.
I don't have a great answer for what the most innovative thing I've seen recently is. And I'm going to be really tweed jacket and elbow patch about it. I'm going to say I'm not concerned always what is the most innovative thing, because this is for all the reasons we just heard, this is a very, very difficult area to study scientifically. And I think that the big deal is overall the baby steps of the application of science to this area to build evidence, to move away over the last, like, say, 10 or 15 years, to move away from really trying to understand things like terrorism and terrorist activity and organizations in context, and thinking more about the importance of understanding how we can respond to and prevent these things, and what that really looks like and what works and what doesn't. and continually working towards those goals has been sort of the sea change in this area that's been most important. And since I don't have a good answer for innovation, I'll do a shameless plug. And I'll say that DHS S&T has recently, within the last month, published a series of reports on the evaluation of the 2020 DHS prevention CP3 grants. And those are available on our website, and we can make sure that that information gets out to everyone. They may be useful. They'll temper your expectation. We are trying to figure this out as we go, learn how to do evaluations, learn how to do them better in this very difficult, complex area, and then apply that to really, again, build that body of knowledge and build that evidence over time. We don't expect to solve this. This problem didn't come into being overnight, and we don't expect to figure it out and solve these problems overnight.
Thank you. That also dovetails to my question. So Wendy, I appreciated your comment that evaluation shouldn't be like a yes or no, thumbs up, thumbs down. And so we should use evaluation as a tool to sort of improve the programs that we have. So with that in mind, thinking about primary prevention, I kind of wondered, what are your thoughts on, for a community-based program, what are the types of outcomes that can be reasonably achieved or understood or measured that your regular run-of-the-mill practitioner might want to try to measure?
It depends on what your goal of the program is. I think and I think Rain has done this too. I think in our CV thing, we had a list, an appendix that lists all the outcomes. Like these are outcomes you could use, but it's a silly exercise in retrospect. Because as we learned, the outcomes, the ways you measure outcome are so unique to the program that probably no two programs that are, say two programs, they're both trying to improve social skills, but they're probably doing it both different in such a way that the outcome measures, even though they seem like they're same goals, but they're different. And the outcome measures are going to be different. And so I don't believe in coming up with lists of outcomes that everybody can choose or people should use, because I think it all has to get tailored very uniquely and specifically to whatever the program is.
I think to add to that would be to, once you do that, and just embrace the outcomes that you get, because they're all valuable. So that, do you all remember the milk carton campaign for missing children? Right? So that started because of a farmer, and turns out 700 or 750 dairies were producing milk cartons with kids' pictures on them. And 2,000 kids go missing a day. The milk carton campaign found 2 kids by accident, and we don't have time to go into those stories, but was that program then not successful? Well, it actually turns out that we were all, the main theme was stranger danger, right, at the time. But of those 2,000, like 115 are taken by strangers. The majority of them are taken by people that they know. We know that now, but we did not know that then. And so the idea about raising awareness, changing our perception of a problem, those are important things to make sure, that could come out of an evaluation, and that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, another oft-used example, I'm sure, let's assume everybody's kind of aware of what the DARE program is, right? Talking about something that, from a political viewpoint, hey, if you run a police department or a sheriff's department, you get extra money to do it. You're going to take that money, you're going to go do it. You're not going to do random assignment. You're going to give that to everybody, because how could awareness and helping people learn about these things be bad? Well, when it was finally evaluated after being in place for 20 years, it turned out that if you were in a really low risk place or a low risk individual to begin with, participating in that program significantly increased your likelihood of abusing drugs when you got older, because it gave you an introduction and education you wouldn't have otherwise had, right? So that's why I say really questioning these things and thinking about what's obvious and what we think is obvious versus what we ought to be measuring to avoid doing harm is one of the most important things that we can do when we're thinking about the big picture when it comes to the type of work that is so important that we're all trying to accomplish together.